And that, my friends, is how America was made great once again. Breaking at this hour, Jimmy Sengenberger is currently at the crossroads of politics and economics. Radio broadcaster master, now the celeb on the web. He's the smarty of the party. He's in cahoots with the grassroots. Jimmy at the Crossroads brings you thought-provoking commentary, hard-hitting interviews, original satire, and the best bumper music known to man. Jimmy at the Crossroads!
Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix, I said. Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix. I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of nonsense. People want answers, they want to understand. They come to the crossroads and Jimmy gives them the plan. I said, gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix. I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of nonsense. Come on, Jimmy, what you got?
Hello, my friends, and welcome to another edition of Jimmy at the Crossroads. I am Jimmy Sengenberger, here with you today once again in partnership with the Washington Examiner on this Thursday, May 7th. Such a pleasure and a privilege to be with you, as always, bringing engaging, intelligent talk, Sang style. Thanks for joining us, being a part of the program. Want to join into the festivities? Feel free to do so by tweeting at me during the show or 24/7, 365 at Sang Center. That's Sang with an E, not an A, Center on Twitter. You can also email me via my website, jimmysengenberger.com, and go to the contact page. Remember, there's no A, there's no I, there's no U in Sengenberger. It's all E's all the time. Once you know that, Sengenberger is easy. Also, be sure to be following us on Facebook, Jimmy Sengenberger Media Personality, as well as a subscriber to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy at the Crossroads. And follow our partners at the Washington Examiner on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube as well. Plus, WashingtonExaminer.com, the place to go to get so much excellent content, so many great reporting stories and commentary pieces, plus audio-visual content as well. So great to be with you today. In just a bit, we will be joined by Spencer Brown. He is the spokesman for the Young America's Foundation, which just partnered with the Federalist on a brand new poll of Millennials and Generation Z on how this crisis is impacting them. It should be a fascinating discussion. Some very interesting results have been discovered from this survey. So we'll talk with Spencer Brown of Young America's Foundation coming up here in just a bit. Then, good friend of the show, Bazzel Baz returns. Of course, he was an actor for seasons 1 through 4 of the Blacklist. I hope his character Baz returns. That is, Baz is a character name as well as his name, Bazzel Baz. Baz was the paramilitary leader for Raymond Reddington on the Blacklist for those first 4 seasons. In addition, Bazzel Baz is himself a former CIA officer for a number of years and also is an ex-Marine. He's got some great insights on the Wuhan lab situation and the questions surrounding this virology lab, where the Trump administration, many leaders of it, seem to think that's where this virus began, where it was experimented on and then from there introduced out into the world. Now, there are those who deny that idea, who say that's ridiculous, no way, no how. I'm convinced that it is very likely to be the case. We'll talk with former CIA officer Bazzel Baz about that and some of the potential fallout vis-a-vis China. And finally, we will be joined by Rick Jackson. Rick is the chairman and CEO of Jackson Healthcare, a healthcare company that is just one of those being decimated by the policies going on in this crisis. Yes, struggling, decimated because of the policies of this crisis, shutting down healthcare operations largely unrelated to COVID-19. We will talk with Rick Jackson about that and his tremendous op-ed from last week. Coming up here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. So lots to happen, lots to take place, but first, let's go to cut 3 here. Bill de Blasio is the mayor of New York City. He is pretty much a socialist himself, and he is looking to the federal government to effectively bail out New York State. Here's a piece of an interview he did, I think yesterday, on CNN, arguing exactly that.
The whole focus has to be on protecting the people of this country. That's more important than the almighty dollar. That's more important than anything. And right now, what I fear is there's a rush to reopen, in some places at least, that's going to end up with people losing their lives who didn't have to lose their lives, who could have been saved if there had been more care. What we learned the hard way here in New York over the last 2 months is this is a ferocious enemy. And the way you defeat it, the way you push it back, is with really tightening up the social distancing and the face coverings and the shelter in place, all the things that New Yorkers actually have done to a remarkable degree. And I got to tell you, John, not easy to do here and not what I would have expected New Yorkers to be able to take to so quickly, but they've done an amazing job. But my message to the rest of the country is learn from how much effort, how much discipline it took to finally bring these numbers down and follow the same path until you're sure that it's being beaten back, or else if this thing boomerangs, you're putting off any kind of reason.
So that's Bill de Blasio actually arguing about the reopening. So I signaled the wrong clip here. But his point is, New York City is a success story that demonstrates that mitigation's working. I am not convinced any longer. I mean, it was something where I thought we'd go along with, seemed like there was logic to it. But the data doesn't seem to be demonstrating clearly enough, in my view, that these mitigation efforts of shelter in place, stay at home, are actually the reason why we have been seeing a reduction in the spread of this virus. We've never tried this before, of quarantining basically everybody except for certain circumstances and certain types of operations. We've never tried this before, so it's not like we can compare it to an alternative, especially since they went ahead and did this sort of initiative. So I'm not convinced about that, and that we should be looking to New York City as a guide for how this has truly been successful. But let's go to cut 4. This is Bill de Blasio arguing about state bailouts.
You're talking about what would be a 4th stimulus plan, direct federal funding to states and cities. And to that, as you said, the president has said mixed messages. But one of the things he said is, I don't think Republicans want to be in a position where they bail out states that are or have been mismanaged over a long period of time.
Yeah, John, it's astounding that he even introduces the question of red states and blue states. He's saying it out loud. He is politicizing a pandemic, not being patriotic, not talking about all Americans and how to bring us all back together. We're all connected. This is the largest city in the country. We help lead the national economy for everyone. We send a huge amount of money to Washington, much more than we get back. And this is a city that has been succeeding. We've had record low unemployment before this crisis. We're the safest big city in America. Crime levels down to where they were in the 1950s, a thriving economy. We've been succeeding here. A lot of cities have been succeeding in helping the American economy. And now the president's turning his back because of partisan affiliation. Who does that, John? What kind of president in the middle of a crisis says, well, I'm going to help you, but I'm not going to help you because of what's on your voter registration card? No, what we need here is a stimulus that puts us all back on our feet so we can succeed together. If it doesn't happen, I guarantee you there's no recovery. And I hate saying that, but John, it's the truth. If there is not a strong 4th stimulus.
No recovery unless Trump gives us money. Couple of quick thoughts. First of all, yes, the president has acknowledged that states that are particularly, shall we say, in particularly difficult straits when it comes to their finances, that they are blue states, they are Democratic states. Now, I don't think you should have said that. I don't think it's helpful, but it is a fact. And it's a fact particularly because those states have been doing all sorts of profligate things in terms of different programs, pension benefits, and so forth, without being fiscally responsible. And now they are looking to the federal government to bail them out for years of irresponsibility on a fiscal level and mismanagement of taxpayer funds in states and cities across the country. It is most certainly the case that New York provides a heck of a lot into the American economy. Well, that's particularly because it's the investment capital of the world. It's the financial capital of the world. We shouldn't be looking to states and cities and making a determination, oh, you give a lot more in taxpayer dollars to the federal government than you take, and therefore that means we should do this policy, versus if you actually were getting more than you give us, then we should do a different policy. We shouldn't be governing like that. That is an irresponsible and inappropriate way to govern, and a wrong way for Bill de Blasio to message this thing. But what he's saying is that the federal government should bail out New York City and other states for their own irresponsibility. Now, yes, we are in the midst of this crisis, but at this point, it is a policy decision on the part of these governors and mayors on whether or not to reopen. Purely policy decision when the facts lean clearly, in my view, toward the reopening. And at this point, we shouldn't be talking about bailing them out. We should be talking about the need for them to start reopening the economies so that things can get rolling again and they can start getting tax revenue into their own coffers. We should not be basically giving them a federal license to perpetuate a policy that is no longer tenable. That is these shutdowns. Basically, it is a bailout of states making their own decisions on these shutdowns at this point. We have already seen more than $3 trillion spent on this crisis, and the idea that we should spend potentially trillions more is unjustifiable. We need to get things reopened. And Bill de Blasio shouldn't be looking to just have the federal government bail him out. He needs to be figuring out the pathway forward to reopen his economy and get money flowing back into his city's coffers. Do the responsible thing, the responsible way of addressing this crisis now, financially. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger. You're watching Jimmy at the Crossroads in partnership with the Washington Examiner. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, Spencer Brown will join us from Young America's Foundation. He's a spokesman there. We're going to talk about this new, very fascinating survey of millennials and Gen Zers and what they're saying about how this crisis they anticipate is impacting them. Keep it right here. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger. Lots more coming up. We are just getting started.
Census Bureau, I need to take your census.
Aye.
All right, let's get started. Can you identify yourself?
Yeah, this is me.
When is your birthday?
September 15th.
What year?
Every year.
Race?
Republican.
Is this a house, an apartment, or mobile home?
Mobile apartment.
How many people are living in your home?
2.
How many people are not living in your home?
Approximately 7.8 billion other people. Minus 2.
Please identify all that apply. Samoan, Geneva, Milano, Brussels, Neapolitan, Danish.
Thin mint.
And finally, would you like to be a donor?
Oh, sure. Tonsils, toenails, and elbows.
America's politics are crazy. The culture is in flux. That's why we work hard to help you keep up.
More politics, more culture, and more access.
We focus on the biggest stories of the day with some of the biggest names in politics and punditry. Go to
Hello, Jimmy. This is President Ronald Reagan, calling from the great beyond on your hotline. It's a different number than the one I used to contact Mr. Gorbachev, but it's no less important, especially at this kind of time. Well, Nancy and we stay on the ranch now here in heaven, and we're your biggest fans. We sit out on the porch there, and I'll have my Nancy, bless her heart, she makes me some tea, and we listen to your show, every minute of it. We fully support you in what you're about to accomplish in the future. Nothing but peaceful progress. Some people say, well, what will Jimmy do now? Well, stand by, because you're going to see some real fireworks. This young man has so many great ideas, and so forth. Why, I hate to interrupt, Ronnie, but let me just say this about that. I couldn't agree more with the way that you and Nancy feel about this entire thing. Jackie and I have been observing and listening to the Sengenberger show, and with regards to that, he's on the edge of a new frontier. No looking back, and I declare that by the time this decade is out, he'll have a syndicated show that will spread all the way across the universe. Oh, well, Jimmy, that was Jack Kennedy. He likes to get every word in edgewise. I tease him a lot. He likes to go out on my boat there and tool around on the sailboat. Well, Nancy brings him lemonade. He enjoys it. Yes, we're both, all of us are big fans. Oh, well, Jimmy, it seems that Nancy's ringing that old chuck wagon dinner bell, and it's time to go get all the fixins. Coming, Mother. So, we'd just like to say congratulations. Well done. In closing, I'd like to say that if you ever run into an obstacle that seems too big or too daunting, well, I'll say this. Mr. Sengenberger, tear down that wall.
Ladies and gentlemen, back to your host of the Crossroads, Mr. Jimmy Sengenberger.
Welcome back indeed to Jimmy at the Crossroads. I am the aforementioned Jimmy Sengenberger. Great to be with you here in partnership once again with the Washington Examiner. Such a pleasure and a privilege indeed. In just a little bit, we will be joined by Bazzel Baz, actor from the Blacklist. Also, of course, he's become a good friend of the show. A former CIA officer, fascinating insights. He was the first one to tell me that it might be the case that this virus was originally from the Wuhan virology lab. We're going to have an interesting conversation, as always, with Bazzel Baz, also an ex-Marine, coming up here in just a little bit on Jimmy at the Crossroads. But first, on the show that brings you engaging, intelligent talk, Sang style, I want to talk a little bit about a survey that I found a couple days ago. I saw the article on the Federalist, and it really struck me as being interesting because it shows what is going on in the mindset of Millennials and Generation Z right now as we face this crisis, not just the crisis of the pandemic itself, but also the economic fallout. I mean, Millennials, for example, have a double whammy of the Great Recession and now this crisis and the economic malaise we're in and the recession we now find ourselves in. But also, you've got Generation Z now experiencing their own turmoil. The poll was conducted on behalf of Young America's Foundation and the Federalist, and Young America's Foundation spokesman Spencer Brown joins us to talk about it here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Spencer, welcome to the show, sir. It's good to have you.
Hey, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. So what inspired you guys to move forward with this kind of poll? I mean, what was it particularly about the dynamics we're seeing unfold right now that made you think we really need to look into how these young Americans are doing right now?
Well, yeah, so Young America's Foundation, we work with high school and college students all the time to bring conservative ideas to their campuses and their schools. And so as part of that work, we really do need to understand and know where they're coming from and sort of what they're worried about, what they prioritize in their lives. So that way we're better able to serve them and to help them reach their peers. And so with a poll like this looking at Gen Z, coronavirus and everything else that's brought kind of presented a natural opportunity to get sort of our finger on that pulse and see, how are these young people, sort of the youngest part of the rising generation, how are they being affected by this? How are they viewing the response? Who do they blame for this? And then also just sort of check in and see, what are their priorities for the future? Are those things that are changing compared to the millennials that you mentioned? Because we did see a huge impact in how millennials, prioritize things like getting married and having kids or buying a house due to the Great Recession. And so we were interested to see, how could this maybe impact now Generation Z as well?
Yeah, it's a very detailed survey covering areas where I think people haven't been paying close attention to, and I absolutely agree with you. Like, you have to understand the demographic and the circumstances of the people you're trying to appeal to persuade, to interact with in order to be successful. I've been doing a lot of work myself focusing on the millennial generation, Generation Z. When you're working with college students and high school students, is the up-and-coming generation now. It's crucial. What are some of the overall top-line conclusions you guys drew? And I do have some screen grabs of some of the data from the Federalist story that I saw this about this that we'll put up here on the screen in a moment. But overall, sort of top-line conclusions.
Well, I think one of the things that wasn't super surprising but was good to see nonetheless is that a large majority of Generation Z students are following this situation very closely. And we see sort of what was interesting was where the fear comes in for them. We found that more students are concerned that a friend or a family member will get coronavirus than they themselves are. And while we did find, the disruptions have been significant for everyone, but even Gen Z, these young people, they have had their jobs have been lost. They've had hours cut if they still have a job. Their universities and colleges and high schools have shut down. But we found that more than 3/4 of Gen Z students polled actually support the disruptions to the economy and day-to-day life because it keeps people safe, even if it affects their own generation negatively. So I think that was heartening to see. That I know a lot of people kind of malign young people in general. I know millennials got the bad end of that deal for a long time as being selfish and self-absorbed and not caring about anyone else. But what the poll showed is that young people are actually concerned that people in their life may get coronavirus and, suffer from that. But they're still okay with paying a price right now in order to help get us all through this.
It's so interesting. Let's put up, this is YAF3. Again, from the Federalist story about this, 79%, going to your point, of Generation Z students believing these disruptions are necessary. What do you think is underneath that? I mean, is it concern for their parents, for their grandparents specifically, or is there something a little bit more? Because there is this notion among a lot of conservatives especially that the government has gone too far in this circumstance. And so if you're going to be trying to persuade Generation Z that you shouldn't, moving forward, have too much government involvement, I think that number is one that we need to pay attention to.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And one of the other we didn't just ask about coronavirus, we asked sort of general ideological questions as well in this poll. What we found is that almost a half of all Gen Z students view the federal government as a threat to their personal freedoms and liberties. And so there is still sort of that recognition there that the government, while they're okay going along with what they're saying now, they do still see it as a threat. And we also saw that they prefer to have a smaller government with lower taxes and fewer services than a larger government with higher taxes. But then one of the other things that we often see in polls like this, that we've seen in a number of our own polling results, is that while they say they want lower taxes and less government, when you ask them just about government programs, they actually think we need more government programs. And so that's where we see, one of those really clear opportunities like you were just mentioning, where this is a place to say, okay, if you want government programs, who's going to pay for that? That's the taxpayers. And so it's a great opportunity to illustrate the fact that the government, you say it's a threat, you still want the government to do things, but you also don't want to pay more in taxes. There's clearly an opportunity there to say, here's where that doesn't add up, and here's how we get the result we actually want.
I think the same thing goes for millennials, who have this dichotomy of, we want the government to be more involved because we think that people have been struggling so much due to economic failures and strife and so forth. But at the same time, personal liberty is something that is very much a value of Generation Y, and it is good to see that Generation Z is picking that up perhaps even more so.
Yeah, I mean, that whole idea of sort of individual liberty and the freedom to do what you want is something that really does fit in well with sort of the personality that both millennials and Gen Z have taken on, where, they're in this time where, thanks to online and social media, you can have people basically creating businesses on their own, doing all these startups, making a name for themselves and becoming famous just because of TikTok, or for millennials, I guess it was Vine back then. And you see that they really do want the freedom to do whatever makes them, find fulfillment or whatever that may be. And so that sort of thing is why, talking about entrepreneurship and the importance of making the life that you want by yourself is so important. But obviously, when we look at some of these numbers, we see there's a disconnect where they still think the government should be the one helping people rather than, people just in general in the free market system helping each other out of necessity in order to stay open as a business.
Now, I do want to put up two more images that will kind of help to encapsulate this. Number 5 shows the information you gave about the smaller government, rather having a smaller government with fewer government programs and lower taxes. And then also number 6, which was interesting, about 46% of Gen Z high school and post-secondary students believing that the federal government threatens their own personal rights and freedoms. How do you square that circle? I mean, what do you think is the reasoning why, on the one hand, you would see Generation Z want more individual liberty and have that protected, and in many cases believe that the federal government is impinging upon individual liberty, but at the same time looking to the government? Because I think some of that really goes to the core of the millennial question as well, but particularly for Generation Z. I mean, what do you think is that dichotomy? Is it education that's part of it, or are there other factors in play?
Well, I think part of it is just because Gen Z now, is mostly high school students and then some college students, I suppose. A lot of them haven't had that situation yet where they realize sort of the full force of the government and what that means in your daily life whenever it comes time to do taxes, if you start a business and you have to comply with all these regulations. And so if you look at what they've learned and what their experiences are, they haven't had those sort of harsh interactions with what government takes and what it does in order to get by. And then on the flip side, all they're really learning, unfortunately, in most of these classrooms and from these professors and from their other peers, is just sort of a glorification of things like the New Deal and, the bank bailouts and the auto manufacturing bailouts. And so they're being told, again, not the complete story. So all they're getting is like, oh, government programs have saved this country repeatedly through history, if you listen just to the lessons, while they themselves haven't had that assumption sort of tested in the real world yet.
And I think that goes, again, it's the same concept with millennials. For example, 2008 financial crisis, I was entering college as a freshman, and I remember through my 3 years, managed to get out a year early, which going to a private school, Regis University in Denver, was very helpful. But I'm remembering all of these students who were being told, or themselves talking about how capitalism had failed, and therefore we needed more government action to step in order to help people. And I think a lot of Gen Z, they were young kids during the Great Recession, and they may have seen their parents struggling, or an older sibling who might be a millennial who was having these ideas of, what am I going to do when I get out of college? Am I going to be able to succeed in life, find a job, prosper? And then they were coming out, and we'll get to higher education costs in a moment, but am I going to be able to get my debt paid back and what have you? And so there's this idea that the government is trying to step in to address a failure of capitalism, and that may be something we're seeing with Gen Z right now too, that sort of reinforces some of the ideas that they have been taught or haven't been taught.
I think that's definitely accurate. The left, almost all the time, whenever there is really any crisis, they always scapegoat something that conservatives love, and usually it's kind of a bedrock principle. Instead, it's actually a failure of government that is to blame, but obviously they can't admit that, because then that would call into question the whole point of having a government supposedly in charge of and running and taking care of everything else. And so we see that anytime there's economic issues, they say this is a problem with the free market, rather than usually there was some kind of government mucking around in there, trying to kind of tinker with things that ends up being negative because you weren't allowing a true free market to flourish and allow prosperity. We see the same thing anytime, there's some sort of mass shooting or a violent incident like that. They always blame the Second Amendment rather than government. And unfortunately, in many of those tragic cases, you can easily point to a phase along the way leading up to that where the government failed to do what it's supposed to do, or what it claims to do, which is to protect people and enforce the law. And so, it's one of those things that, again, when you're in that bubble of education, it's obviously worse in college, but we see it in high school with our students as well. When you're in that bubble, you're only really getting the one side, which is, again, this glorification of government, and you never hear about all the failures or the problems with it. And that's why, once you get into the real world and you start paying taxes and you see every month or every 2 weeks on your paycheck how much is taken out, you're like, wait a second, what are they doing with that money?
Sure. Well, and I would say that what you just added on is such an important point. I mean, you look at the financial crisis 2008. If you actually look deeply at it, you will find that it was years of failed government policies that led to the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And then today, we have government shutdowns that have been enforced by government. Sure, I think a lot of people would have shut down their businesses anyway because of health concerns, but nevertheless, it was the government stepping in and taking these actions, but also failing to prepare as far as getting, in some cases, getting ventilators ready and stocked up right away and so forth. Although I would add that we ended up not really having those shortages that were foretold because the private market did step up. But I do think that there are a lot of fallacies in the understanding of young people because of the educational aspects and so forth that where we cannot let them continue to think that the financial crisis of 2008 and what we're facing today are due to capitalism, because it's not true.
Well, yeah, and they'll always keep trying to scapegoat that. And I mean, the way they talk about things like the Great Depression and the New Deal, they again paint it in exactly the same thing, where this is solely the responsibility of free markets, or this idea that we should be free to participate and engage with whom we want in the market. And they never talk about government policy or how government, the government creates the problem, and the government is then needed to fix the problem. But nobody ever actually lays it out like that. And that's sort of what's wrong with education today.
Let's do two final things here with you, Spencer Brown, again, spokesman for Young America's Foundation. Let's put up YAF 2. 48% of post-secondary students have changed their post-graduation plans as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. Expand on that for us.
Yeah, so that was one of those things we wanted to find out just sort of generally. A lot of people that I was talking to who are our students on campuses and our activists around the country were telling me, how this was affecting not just the fact that they, can't walk at a graduation this spring or they can't have a summer internship. I was interested to know if this was actually changing their plans for once they're done with college or done with high school. And what we found there, almost half of students who are currently in college have now changed what they're planning on doing once they graduate. So that's not just people who, just are graduating right now. That's people who could still be looking, at 2 or 3 years of college before they graduate. But this sort of a thing is already making them think twice about what their plans were and whether they're sustainable. And that's one of those things that I think will tie back in with what we saw with millennials reacting to the Great Recession, where, again, all of a sudden you're doing the calculus of what if I can't get a job after I graduate? Can I afford to go to school? What program should I be in? What sort of are the industries that will hire me right now? And we did see that have a lasting impact, because then the ultimate sort of result of concern about money led to delaying getting married, having children, buying homes. And then that, again, also rippled through the economy, where you have fewer people in these stable long-term relationships, fewer people owning property and building equity. And I think that sort of thing could happen here too. But the question is, now that this is really a global phenomenon, and the United States, thankfully, is, I think, better prepared than most other countries in the world to bounce back from this. I think we can limit sort of the damaging changes. Some of the changes that will come out of this will arguably be good, because it's driven all this innovation with online e-commerce and everything else. But seeing that half of college students are changing their plans definitely suggests that this is a bigger thing than just what's happening in this year and this summer.
And final question for you, Spencer Brown. I mean, obviously, there seems to be a lot of similarities between how we can win over millennials and how conservatives can win over Generation Z. When you distill it down for people as far as what we need to do in order to be effective, what's your encapsulating sort of elevator pitch on how to win over young Americans?
Well, one of the biggest things, it's actually an example that our incoming, the new president-elect of Young America's Foundation, Governor Scott Walker of Wisconsin, often uses, and it's the example between Uber and taxi. If you want to see what conservative and free market solutions can do, ask young people today, when was the last time you took a taxi? Unless they live in New York, I'm guessing they've never thought about calling to order a taxi the night before they're going to the airport, and they've never tried to hail a cab walking out of a restaurant after dinner. They all use Uber on their phones, or Lyft, or whatever it is. And that is just one of those examples that is so easy and so sort of immediate for students to realize, oh yeah, Uber is a way better solution. The government sure didn't create that. The government has done everything actually to shut that down and destroy it.
That's right.
But it's those real world, real life examples for young people that they can think about immediately. And it doesn't require, that deeper philosophical thing that is important eventually. But at that starting point where you start kind of making them question, is the government good? Is the government helpful? What can the government do? It's things like that, those real stories that actually can make a difference and make people think twice.
And what's the YAF website where folks can go to read the study themselves?
Yeah, all of the information from this poll and everything else YAF has going on can be found on our website, which is yafyaf.org.
You have to make it so complicated, Spencer Brown. Great to talk with you. Thanks so much for joining us. A very important and fascinating study that I think confirms a lot of things I would think might be true. So I appreciate you joining us today, and stay well and be healthy.
Absolutely, you too.
Thank you again. Spencer Brown, spokesman for Young America's Foundation, joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. We're going to take a break, and when we return here on the show, good friend of the program, Bazzel Baz, will be back to join us, and we will talk with him about the Wuhan virology lab, what we know, what we can understand, some of the controversy surrounding that discussion, and more. So we've got a lot coming up with Bazzel Baz. Plus, Rick Jackson, chairman and CEO of Jackson Healthcare, will join us when we continue here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner.
Hi, Tom. Gee, you look terrible.
I feel terrible. Achy, fevery, nauseous.
Ooh, that's too bad. You ought to...
Chills, stuffiness, bloating.
Yeah,
Scratchy, gassy, drippy.
I know. Say, Tom, you should try Wearaflu.
Wearaflu?
Wearaflu is the only medication that actually takes your flu symptoms and hides them at various places inside your body, so that by the time your body finds them all, your flu is gone. In the meantime, you're back to work.
You were right, Ed. Wearaflu lets me ignore my flu symptoms and gets me back to work. Thanks.
Yeah, and thanks for coming in and infecting the rest of the office.
Come out wherever you are with Wearaflu. Take as directed.
Safe, unsafe. Very safe, completely unsafe. Extremely insanely safe. X Games unsafe. Who's there? What do you want?
It's me, Arnold. Don Trump, I need to ask you a favor. I need you to stop using my quotes and my movie titles in your speeches. When you talk to the public, it gives them the wrong idea that somehow I support you.
I can do whatever I want. I am, after all, Commander-in-Chief.
Ah, that's what I mean right there. You can't just blatantly rip people off. That is a movie that I was in, not you, me.
I can do as I wish, as I totally recall.
See what I mean? That was a great movie I did with Jamie Lee Curtis and James Cameron, and neither one of those two support you, and now you're using that. You can't keep on doing this.
That's exactly media true lie right there.
That's what I mean. You can't say that.
I don't know. Whatever became of us, Arnold? We used to be like brothers, like twins.
That's the last straw. I can't take it anymore. There's something wrong with you. You must have something in your brain.
It's not a tumor.
Ah, that's it. That's it. That's from Kindergarten Cop. You can't steal that.
You know what? You're fired.
You can't fire me. I don't work for you anymore. I quit.
I want you to get Pence on the line right away, Mike Pence. We're going to send him down to Mar-a-Lago, and we're going to put a stop to this Arnold business. Tell him to run. Go. Get to the chopper.
I heard that. Knock it off now, or I'll be back. Unlike you in 2020, I'll be back.
Get him out.
And now, the further future adventures of Starship Winkler.
Thanks for coming to this medical convention with me, Captain. You're a true friend.
You promised there'd be green women.
Well, I'd like you to meet some of my colleagues. This is Dr. Scholes, podiatrist.
How do you do?
And this is Dr. Pepper.
Gesundheit.
Oh, and here comes Dr. Phil. He's a psychiatrist.
Well, every pancake has two sides. And
You're right, Doc. He is boring.
I'm right here.
And this is Dr. Spock, child psychologist.
Goodgy.
And of course, this is Dr. Octopus.
Oh, hello. How do you do?
How do you do?
How do you do? Hi, give me 5. Pleased to meet you. Give me 5. How do you do? So, Doc Ock, what's your field?
I am a proctologist.
Oh, I wish I hadn't shaken all 8 hands.
Well, did the captain bring enough hand sanitizer? Tune in next time when we hear...
And this is Dr. Quinn, medicine woman.
Finally, a woman.
Hey, how are ya? Hey, how are ya? Hey, how are ya?
Ugh.
On Starship Winkler.
And Crossroad fans, back to the sets. Let's welcome back Mr. Sang Style himself, Jimmy Sengenberger.
Rocking and rolling back, Jimmy at the Crossroads, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner. I am Jimmy Sengenberger. Great to be with you once again, and thanks to Spencer Brown from Young America's Foundation for coming on to talk about that fascinating report. As we continue on the show that brings you engaging, intelligent talk, Sang style, Jimmy at the Crossroads. Great to be with you. And look, there's been a lot of talk, understandably so, about China and China's role in the coronavirus. That is to say, at the minimum, not warning the world about what was to come and the human-to-human transmissibility of this virus. But have they also been trying to hide the reality of how this was developed? Was it in the Wuhan virology lab, for example? We know it started in Wuhan. There have been a lot of reports about this. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and President Trump both have said that there is significant amount of evidence for this. We have talked about it on the program before, particularly with our next guest, Bazzel Baz, who is a former CIA officer, also retired Marine, and the founder of the Association of Recovery of Children, which literally in the dark of night will rescue children without their captors knowing, who have been trafficked. It's wonderful work. And, of course, he's also a former, maybe future, star on the Blacklist. Bazzel Baz rejoins us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Baz, my friend, welcome back.
Morning, Jimmy. How are you?
You know, I'm doing all right. It's so good to see you and talk with you again. I appreciate you joining us. You were the first one, I think you were the first one that I hadn't even seen an article yet, who told me a little bit that you were hearing some things maybe about this virology lab. What do you think we know about this? Because there is some discussion. Is it where this started or not?
Well, I think that probably NSA, the agency, and a number of other agencies that are responsible for gathering the required intelligence for the president to make policy changes or decisions regarding this is probably pretty solid. Particularly with some of the statements that the president's making already. He's probably already read the papers, the intel reports. I think that it's not a matter, Jimmy, of whether it was done at that lab or the lab down the street. What we do know is for the fact that this was worked up in China itself. We also know enough about China over the years to know that it is virtually impossible for anything of this nature to have been developed without the oversight of the government. And the distribution of this, whether we want to call it an attack or a leak or a mishap or whatever you want to call it, was not done or did not occur without the government knowing it. I see the kind of the language now is kind of leaning towards, at least in some of the more liberal media platforms, that maybe they're just guilty of just not telling us. Maybe it slipped and something went wrong and they were embarrassed and they just didn't know what to do.
Sure.
That's not the case.
I want to play cut 7 here. This is a snippet of Secretary of State Mike Pompeo yesterday, who had a press event where he talked with the press about China a good bit in this conversation.
China could have spared the world descent into global economic malaise. They had a choice, but instead China covered up the outbreak in Wuhan. Its National Health Commission ordered virus samples destroyed on January 3rd. China disappeared brave Chinese citizens who raised alarms. It deployed its propaganda organs to denounce those who politely called for simple transparency. And that brings us to today, 120 days on. China is still refusing to share the information we need to keep people safe.
Bazzel Baz, the big question is, why isn't China providing additional information? And some would say that maybe it's because they have something very specific to hide, which is that this was indeed originated in some fashion from a lab in China, and they don't want us to be able to definitively prove it.
You know, based on my experience, when I start hearing things like this, what we start wondering is that exactly that, Jimmy. What else is there at that lab or other labs or labs we're not aware of that have other dangerous viruses or other things that they probably should not have been working on? We have to remember something, is that China isn't interested in being anyone's partner. Economically, financially, on the military front. They are interested in dominating the United States, dominating the world. And so in order for you, if you're transparent, if you say, hey, we made a mistake, then what that generally requires is people like the US or other countries being allowed to come in your country to say, look, then let us get in there to figure out how you made that mistake. How did it slip through the cracks? We want to make sure it never happens again. And then that's when we start discovering other things. And I am pretty certain that the Chinese probably don't want us in there, knowing what else they have been working on.
Former CIA officer Bazzel Baz joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Let's do this, because there's been a lot of discussion in the media trying to discredit this idea. And one of the people that they're pointing to is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Esper. I want to play cut 8 first, and then we'll do cut 9, which is a clip from CNN discussing what Esper had to say. So here's the general.
Is it natural, or was it man-made somehow, or somehow manipulated by man-made procedures? As I said the last time, and I am still where I was the last time, the weight of evidence, nothing's conclusive. The weight of evidence is that it was natural and not man-made. Secondly, the second issue is, was it accidentally released? Did it release naturally into the environment, or was it intentional? We don't have conclusive evidence in any of that, but the weight of evidence is that it was probably not intentional. The third issue is location. Did it come out of the virology lab in Wuhan? Did it occur in the wet market there in Wuhan? Did it occur somewhere else? And the answer to that is we don't know. And as mentioned by many people, various agencies, both civilian and U.S. government, are looking at that. It would help a great deal if the Chinese government would open up and allow inspectors and investigators to go there in full transparency, so that the world can know the actual original source of this, so that we can apply the lessons learned and prevent outbreaks in the future.
Just a quick correction. That's actually General Mark Milley. Esper is the defense secretary. So let's play cut 9 now and then get your reaction. This is a clip from CNN after they had played some of what the general said.
Well, Dr. Fauci now weighing in, Jake, saying that from everything that he's seen of the evolution of this virus, that it moved naturally from an animal to a human. And Jake, that part, that this is not man-made, is pretty much universally accepted. The Office of Director of National Intelligence is on the record saying as much. Where the divisions start is where exactly the the virus originated in Wuhan, whether it started in that market or was an accidental release from the lab. Dr. Fauci is saying that regardless, it started in nature. And what you're hearing from members of the Trump administration, including Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, they're pushing this theory that it was accidentally released from a lab. Now you have the U.S. intelligence community, which generally doesn't say anything in public unless they have an assessment, coming out saying they're looking into both those theories, the market and the lab. And in fact, they say that they have evidence of both. The only thing that they're saying with certainty is that it came from China and that it's not man-made. But in seeing the Trump administration pushing this theory that it was accidentally released from a lab, the U.S. finds itself increasingly in isolation, at odds with its intelligence partners. I was speaking with a Western diplomatic official who has seen the intelligence, who says that it's highly likely that the virus was not an accidental release. This is, according to this official, the growing consensus of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing partnership that includes Great Britain, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. And so what you're seeing is this group of nations essentially saying that what they're seeing is an assessment. It's not 100%, but what they believe is that the virus occurred in nature and came out of this lab. But Jake, what everyone came out of the market.
Bazzel Baz, so I threw a lot of sound at you. Please go ahead and tell us your former intelligence officer opinion on this.
Look, a lot of people on there are dancing with their words, okay? So let's say it, quote unquote, started in nature. In other words, we found it in nature. It still went to a lab. So if you're not listening to if you're not really listening to what they're not saying, and you're just paying attention to what they are saying, you're like, oh my gosh, well, they're off the hook because, look, it started in the wet market. Okay, let's say we found it in the wet market. Then why did it end up in a lab? And what happened to it when it ended up in a lab? And why was it in the lab? And what were they doing with it in the lab? Like everything else. And did they take it there and did they re-engineer it? Did they do something different with it? Was it, tag and tailed with the H1N influenza vaccine that they gave a lot of people in Italy at one time, making them more susceptible to this virus or this new virus, So we have to, I think if you listen to the end of what you just heard in CNN, there's a lot of evidence that leads us to believe that something, let's just say that, something took place in this lab and created something that's doing a lot of damage and killing people. And now the question is, was it released intentionally or was it not released intentionally? And there is more and more intelligence coming out that it was, in fact, a direct attack or launched intentionally against the world, so to speak. We have even now, after being out of the agency, we still keep some pretty strong connections with the intel community and almost kind of like a civilian intel community among a lot of different players throughout the world, politicians, scientists, doctors, the average guy on the street. And if you're really paying attention to what's been happening prior to all of this, it appears that there are a lot of other people at some very big levels, FDA, AMA, scientific communities, that all kind of knew about this process happening way ahead of time. And there are just some things that just appear to be just way too convenient. Things people said a year previous, or people being involved in this process that aren't even scientists. Look, I don't
What do you
mind
mean
saying
by
it.
that? What do you mean by that?
Well, for example, Bill Gates. Bill Gates isn't a scientist. Bill Gates isn't a doctor. Why is Bill Gates now all of a sudden the authority on a vaccine for the coronavirus? I mean, these things are still in question. Look, there's still some questions about Fauci making statements prior to this that there is a pandemic coming. There are still some questions about Fauci dealing with China when there was moratorium on dealing with China. So there's a lot of interesting questions that need to be answered. What if you start taking a look at the ties in with people like Fauci and his colleagues and the FDA? or the AMA, and why things like, hydroxychloroquine that all of a sudden seem to work on a lot of people, but the FDA is saying, well, there's not enough testing on it, but yet you've got people that are being cured of something. Or here's one yesterday. This blows my mind. The FDA now went after a company, and I know a company that developed chlorine dioxide. Now, chlorine dioxide has been used as a water purification element for years. I mean, there are many of us that have used it across the board in the jungles of Africa and South America to kill viruses, anti-malarial, whatever it may be. And there are companies that produce this as water purification. In fact, there was a time, and there are some government studies that show that chlorine dioxide actually kills pathogens. Yet that's never being mentioned. Or all of a sudden it's getting notoriety and people are getting better. And yet the FDA now is starting to attack those companies that are creating chlorine dioxide.
Well, I have to say,
there's these little things, like this, when they're happening, and they go, well, there are not enough studies, but yet you've got 20,000 people that are taking something and they're killing off the virus. The question is, why don't you look at it? Well, maybe because there's not billions of dollars, or maybe big pharmaceutical companies got their hand in it. It's a lot of things. People never learned in the intel community. Money is a very important thing to a lot of people.
Well, one thing in my mind is that this just a whole thing underscores. Last Friday, we spent the whole day talking about, the whole show on Free to Choose Friday, talking about getting the FDA off the backs of innovation when it comes to prescription drugs and doctors being able to prescribe it to patients. In other words, limit the role of the FDA so you don't have these situations where maybe some companies are trying to block the introduction of certain medications, or the FDA deciding they don't want this or that to be done because they have their hands all over the approval process. But then also you have this supposed whistleblower now who's saying, oh, he wasn't part of the Trump administration wanting to push hydroxychloroquine, which is unproven, and the media is hyping that up. So it does raise a whole slew of questions, but I want to get back to China here with you in our last few minutes, Bazzel Baz. That is, the Wall Street Journal has an editorial today calling on the Trump administration, if they have this evidence that suggests this may be the case, to release said evidence. What do you think about the idea of Trump, Pompeo, General Milley, any of these folks actually saying, here's what we have that suggests that China may have done this, versus just saying it out loud?
Well, I think that as you collect the intel, Jimmy, one of the things you have to pay close attention to is the strategy that you're going to apply to either negotiate with China, or shut China down, or retaliate against China, or put yourself, the United States, in a better position so this never happens again. And that sometimes can be a kind of a slow process, and it's a very sensitive process to begin with. So as you know, the President of the United States and this administration have been under attack by not only the Democrats, but the liberal community, the socialists, globalists, whatever it may be, that exist here in America. So I think that they're just being careful of what they release and how they release it and the timing of it, because quite honestly, they have their hands full right now. And I don't blame them for that. It's not that the American people won't know, but sometimes you have intelligence gathering is ongoing. And until you've collected all the information that you need to make a proper assessment, you just can't release that in bits and pieces to the American public.
But why have they been talking about this and saying, oh, we have evidence, while not releasing evidence?
Well, I think they want to comfort America. I think they want to make sure that America understands that, definitely, guess what?
Sure.
We were attacked. We didn't do this to ourselves. And so we want China to know that we know, and that we're never going to let it happen again. But the specific information, the people behind it, how it was released, whoever, that'll eventually come, I'm pretty sure. But it has to be done at the right time.
It's interesting. So let's do the... Sure. Well, we're running out of time here, Bazzel Baz, but let's do the final question that I always like to ask you as someone who is an alum from the Blacklist, which is, of course, one of my favorite television shows. Paint a picture, this scenario, what you're describing, and how it might play out in an episode of The Blacklist starring James Spader.
Oh my gosh. James Spader and Baz go to the White House. The president in a secret meeting says, all negotiations are off the table with China. We don't know what to do. I'm surrounded by the cabal. I'm even finding that some of the closest medical people to my organization, some of the greatest and most powerful technology leaders in the United States are all part of the cabal. I don't know what to do. And so James Spader says, Baz, we're taking a trip. So Spader and Baz, what they do is they simultaneously put a plan into motion where they literally kidnap 20 of the top most powerful globalists that they know were a part of this virus thing, and they put them in a shipping container on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And then Baz takes his team in and they go into the Wuhan lab. Of course, there's a lot of shooting, a lot of bad guys get killed, of course. And they not only discover that the Wuhan virus was in fact there, but they discovered 5 other viruses that the Chinese had been working on. So they steal all of those and they destroy the lab. They come back and they put them in the shipping container, and they're all, of course, in vials, of course, little tubes. And the 20 great, most powerful cabal leaders are there, and they say, here's the deal. We owe this much money to the Chinese, our debt. You all are going to pay us all of this money, or we're going to break all of these vials, and you're all going to die in this container here. And then we're going to drop you in the ocean and sink you to the bottom, and no one will ever know. So the 20 cabal leaders, what do? They all take all of their money. We take all of their money out of their accounts, and we secretly transfer it to 5 different banks, and the money mysteriously ends up in the U.S. Treasury. But we've already had a talk with the U.S. Treasury that every American in the United States of America, that's a legal American, of course, will receive a portion of all of that money.
This is the third time we've had you on and that I've asked you for a scenario, and that is the single most elaborate that you've come up with. And you know what? I could absolutely see that happening in an episode of The Blacklist. Baz, always great to talk with you, my friend. Fascinating perspective, former intelligence operative. Thanks so much for joining us here on the show.
You're welcome, Jimmy. Thank you very much. You guys have a great day.
Stay well, be healthy. Once again, Baz joining us. Bazzel Baz joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. We are overdue for a break. In a moment, we will be joined by Rick Jackson, Chairman and CEO of Jackson Healthcare. Talk a little bit about what's happening when it comes to the healthcare industry, which is deeply struggling right now as a result of the, especially government policies, dealing with coronavirus. We will return with that here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Of course, we are coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner. You do not want to miss our next conversation. Stay tuned.
To Obamacare.
Pardon me.
Pardon me. Oh, hey, you must be Freddie May.
Frederick, please.
Yeah, whatever. Hey, listen, I'm Bill O'Goods with OSLAP. That's Obama's Student Loan Acceleration Program, and we just passed Obamacare, right? We're about to pass another bill to nationalize student loans. It's going to be a whole federal takeover.
Excuse me, sir. Could I get you a drink? Yes. Do you have a Lady Gaga?
Of course. One moment, please.
How does this benefit SCALP, the Society of College Academics for Loan Proliferation?
Well, I'm glad you asked. More loans equals more money. That's more money for everybody. You could raise your tuition excrementally in perpetuity forever, and there's nothing they can do about it. You still got to go to school, right? You still got to get a loan. You ain't got no money. It's a win-win. Oh, and here's another thing. You can't discharge student debt by bankruptcy. You could have 3 student loans. You could go you can't declare bankruptcy on any of them. I don't care how much money you don't got.
But what about the students?
The who? Remember, my friend, here at OSLAP, we make money the old-fashioned way. We steal it from the students. This is for you.
So what you're saying is, this is a gold mine.
Indeed it is.
A gold mine.
A gold mine.
Stop! Let me tell you what's really going on with student loan debt today. You see, in 2010, President Barack Obama nationalized the student loan system, tying it to Obamacare. At that point in time, student loan debt across the country totaled $800 billion. Now, about a decade later, that number has doubled to $1.6 trillion. This is particularly because the federal government keeps giving out the loans, which has allowed colleges and universities to blithely increase their tuition without any concern. And the federal government just keeps giving out the loans because guess what? If you're a borrower who's deeply indebted with student loan debt, you cannot discharge that debt in bankruptcy. You're stuck with it for life. That needs to change, particularly because there's no risk to the lender. That means the federal government can keep giving out loans, and also there's no risk to the colleges and universities. So they'll just keep raising tuition regardless. There really does need to be a congressional action done to address this student loan crisis in America. And at the Millennial Policy Center, we have some great extensive research on how to do this, including some bills working their way through Congress. So log on to millennialpolicycenter.org today to learn more.
Right on.
Well, it's going to be a pretty good decade.
Freddie, let's have another.
Oh, let me just.
America's politics are crazy. The culture is in flux. That's why we work hard to help you keep up.
More politics, more culture, and more access.
We focus on the biggest stories of the day with some of the biggest names in politics and punditry.
Go to our website, WashingtonExaminer.com. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Hey, Jimmy Sengenberger, on a scale of 1 to Sang style, how you feeling today? Jimmy Sengenberger, folks.
Nathan Matoush, producer extraordinaire, working the Matoush magic today. Thanks so much for joining us as we continue here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Once again, I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner. My thanks to Bazzel Baz for that last conversation. Boy, when you ask him to come up with a scenario for the Blacklist, you never know what he's going to involve Raymond Reddington, apparently this time himself, in. Great to be with you once again here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. When we are on the show, we talk about a variety of different topics. We run the gamut from, you just heard us talk about China and its possible role here in the coronavirus. We talk about what's happening medically as well as economically, whether it's with the virus or with the broader economy, the stock market and investing occasionally, what's going on in the political dynamics of the day. Well, the economic fallout of the coronavirus crisis and especially the government policies that we have seen put into effect in recent weeks and months is one of the topics that we've been zeroing in on. But we haven't talked too much about what's been happening in the healthcare space. In the first quarter, the first estimated GDP loss was a negative 4.8%, with the healthcare industry chalking up 2.25% percentage points of total gain. So that means 2.25 percentage point loss in economic growth was due to what we're seeing with the healthcare industry. It is stunning to think about that. Well, let's dive into what's happening in the healthcare space and why with Rick Jackson, who is Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Jackson Healthcare, the third largest healthcare staffing company in the United States, with over 3,000 U.S. hospitals that it staffs with clinicians and treating 10 million patients annually. Is a great piece that was in Newsweek in the last week or two. And also, he is a member of the Job Creators Network. Rick Jackson, welcome to the show. Good to have you today.
Thank you, Jimmy. Glad to be with you.
I'm so pleased to have you because we really need to highlight what's been going on in the healthcare space. Give us a 50,000-foot view, and then we'll dive right in.
All right, great. Well, first of all, I think that when you watch TV all the time, all of us are sitting home and so forth, and most of what has dominated the news is what's happening in New York and in the bad places and so forth, and the trauma that they're going through, and it's very real, and it's, you know, obviously there's a concern for that. But what that does is give the perception that this is happening in all hospitals and everywhere in the United States, and it's just simply not true. The facts are that at least 90% of the hospitals are half empty right now. They don't have a lot of the COVID patients. They don't have these problems because we're only glamorizing, unfortunately, you know, the news drives ratings and so forth because if it bleeds, it leads. And so we're only focusing on just the negative, and we're focusing on it 24/7. So this is given that perception that the hospitals are just covered in COVID-19 patients. This came about because the government has restricted elective and outpatient procedures. We're not talking about elective like getting plastic surgery on your nose or something like that. We're talking about brain surgery that can be delayed for 30 or 60 days, total knees, all kind of treatment and so forth. None of the doctor's offices here in Georgia are even open right now. So 70% of people are not even going to see their regular physicians and getting regular treatment and so forth. And most people don't know this. This is surprising to me because I'm in healthcare, that almost 20% of the entire GDP is in healthcare. That's $3.6 trillion a year. It's, you know, $10 billion a day. And right now, this is a self-inflicted wound by basically shutting down healthcare except for the treatment of COVID patients and just dire emergencies and so forth. We're basically losing today about $3 billion a day of the economy based under just healthcare alone. And so
I was just going to say, as you point out in your op-ed for Newsweek, Rick, 43,000 healthcare workers lost their jobs in the first month of this crisis.
Yeah, I think it's actually more than that. You know, that was before, like Mayo Clinic just last week, starting May 1, furloughed 30,000 people. You don't furlough 30,000 people if your hospital is full and you need them for COVID-19 or anything else. And so I would say right now, my guesstimate is probably closer to 500,000 people have been furloughed in healthcare, which is the last place we need it right now. And, you know, and what that does is I got to tell you my biggest concern of that. First of all, by watching TV and so forth, it scares people from going to their doctor and to healthcare. And I get it, but that's because it's so slanted on just those issues. But here's my biggest concern. As a healthcare provider, we're going to have patients that are victims of COVID-19 that have never gotten the virus. There are people today, let me give you an example. There's a saying in the hospital, it's called code gray. You've heard of code red and some of these other things, code blue. Well, this is code gray. These are the people that show up at the hospital dead. They're dead on arrival. That has gone up 50% in the hospitals I've surveyed just in the last 30 days. So people are staying away from necessary treatment and so forth because they're scared of going to the hospital, going to their doctor and so forth. And I'm more concerned about the deaths that's going to cause by us not having these hospitals open.
Yeah, when you talk with the clinicians that you work with in terms of the staffing operations that Jackson Healthcare does, what are they telling you? Because it seems completely logical that what you're saying about the social fallout and the other healthcare issues that people are enduring is a direct result of these government policies that have just said, no, you can't do elective surgery, you can't do other treatments that people may be needing for a variety of different issues. And I mean, I could just imagine when things do fully reopen, God willing, sooner than later, that there will be such an influx of patients because they will have been so tied up with staying at home and not able to seek the treatment that you will suddenly have an overloading of the healthcare system, but you will also have maybe some issues that developed that wouldn't have otherwise developed if they'd sought treatment sooner.
Well, it's a great point. For instance, I've got a friend of mine whose wife had a mammogram in January, and she had a lump in her breast. And so she was scheduled in late February to have a biopsy, which is a very difficult time when you're worried about things like that. Right. Well, her appointment was canceled, and she still, as of today, has not gotten an appointment to have a biopsy. And I can't imagine, as you know, in cancer, the sooner you can get to it and identify it, the better the outcome is. And so you have this in spades everywhere. I do think there's a pent-up demand for surgery that was already scheduled for the last 30 or 60 days and some of those kind of things. At first, when this first happened, I thought this was just going to be a mad rush. As soon as they turn on the hospitals, they're going to be overflooded by regular, hospital needs and so forth like that. I think it's going to take a little bit more than that, more time. It's easier to shut down hospital services than it is to ramp them back up. But hospitals will do it professionally. The biggest issue right now is psychological. In my mind, we have to have our healthcare going 100% on all 8 cylinders, because if my doctor won't see me for a routine checkup, and that they're delaying and canceling that meeting, it kind of, as a consumer, doesn't make me feel very confident about going to the restaurant. And so we have to get that nailed and get it out as soon as possible so that we can build a confidence, psychological confidence, that we can solve this problem and feel safe in this COVID environment.
We're talking with Rick Jackson, Chairman and CEO of Jackson Healthcare, the 3rd largest healthcare staffing company in the country. Rick, what you said a moment ago with the story about the woman who was scheduled in February to get a biopsy, we're coming up on 3 months since that appointment was supposed to be scheduled. I can just imagine how many different Americans across the country are in a similar circumstance, and not only are they worried about contracting COVID-19, but they also have to be very fearful. Could I have this life-threatening illness and it be too late for me to get the treatment that I need? I mean, I could just imagine the not just the frustration about that, but the fear.
Absolutely. I have an aunt right now that her doctor said that they're concerned about giving her cancer treatment because it does reduce your immune system and all that kind of stuff. So she is faced basically with, okay, well, do I solve the immunity problem, with COVID-19? Or do I go ahead and assume I'm going to die because I don't have cancer treatment? Because she has lung cancer. And it's a terrible place to put. But these are some of the decisions that people are making. And I can assure you that when at the end of the day, we're going to have a lot of people that died because of not access to health care, then there are going to die from COVID-19, is my opinion.
Rick Jackson, that is a startling thing to hear, but when we talk about reopening the economy, I mean, obviously, I think most people were well-intentioned in terms of these policies going into effect across the country, thinking, hey, we need to focus our resources on COVID-19, but as we're fond of pointing out on this show, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and there are unintended consequences that can most definitely happen. And I would think that if we don't get things reopened in state after state very, very soon and begin that process now, this situation is just going to get even worse and worse. And what you're talking about more are the health and societal implications of this. We've hardly spent much time in our conversation talking about the financial impact on the healthcare system, particularly hospitals, yet.
Right. Well, in fact, I would tell you, as taxpayers, we're going to be subsidizing the $2 billion a day that we're currently losing right now because the healthcare companies are basically out of business right now. They're going to start back up. And you're right. I don't want to basically have a blanket statement that they should have never shut down and so forth like that. Hindsight's 20/20. But because of the equipment and so forth, the supply chain, they didn't want to have demand on that. They wanted to be able to cover the COVID-19. But that's not an issue now, and we should not do anything that restricts. From my standpoint, the 3 things you've got to do is to open up healthcare and the economy of healthcare immediately. Is, first of all, you got to remove all restrictions. Let hospitals and doctors go back to work and decide themselves what's safe in how to do that. You've got to completely keep them in the PPE and testing capability. And then we just need to get out of the way. If we'll do that, we'll immediately create $2 billion more of GDP per day immediately, and at the same time, keep people safe that needs healthcare treatment
Your
today.
first point, I think, is so salient because we're talking about healthcare workers, doctors, physicians, clinicians, people who understand healthcare and aren't going to take unnecessary risk for their patients. If we're going to trust anybody to be responsible, you have to trust the healthcare workers.
Absolutely. They deal in infectious diseases every day.
Yes.
They understand it. And they know how to delve into that. They know how to create the processes and so forth like that. So, and it bothers me when governors tell doctors what they can and cannot do, especially non-medical people. But I understand how what we did, but it's now time to turn the page and get healthcare back working again.
And finally, Rick Jackson, I want to talk about the financial impact a little bit more on hospitals in particular, the way in which hospitals have been able to stay afloat, to succeed financially is through elective surgeries that have just been completely turned down, where you're not able to do those, and then they have to furlough hospital workers who aren't part of the COVID-19 treatment processes that they have internally. What is the significance of going so long without these elective procedures and elective treatments from the financial standpoint for hospitals?
Well, first of all, it's not only elective surgery; it's all outpatient services. And I mean, people say elective surgery, but it covered a whole bucket of things. 50% hospitals by themselves are $1.1 trillion a year by themselves without any doctors or surgery centers, anybody outside the hospital. They're $1.1 trillion. 50% of that went away 35, 40 days ago, just completely evaporated. And so that's the economics of it right there. It's it's over $1 billion a day just in just that alone. So what we're doing, we're paying for it. I mean, as a healthcare provider, they did send money through Medicare and some of the other things, and so we're going to be paying for that. But hospitals are losing. We have millions of dollars a day here in Atlanta. There's not a hospital in Atlanta that's not losing millions of dollars a day. And we're going to have to pay for that as taxpayers. And all I'm saying is, like, for instance, we have anesthesia in 40 different hospitals in the United States. 3 of them are in New York City, not New York City, in the state of New York. They have 3 patients. Each hospital has 3 patients of COVID-19. There's 100 empty beds that they could have. They could quarantine these people off and then put them in those empty beds. And that immediately would turn on the economic engine and allow them to go back to work. And that's what needs to happen.
What do you make of the argument, and what is the argument in favor of just focusing on COVID-19 at this point, when you have so many open beds at the 3 hospitals you were talking about, 3 patients, 100 beds?
There's absolutely no argument for saying that hospitals need to be available, except for 1 or 2 hotspots. I bet you there's not 50 hospitals. There's 6,000 hospitals in the United States. There's not 50 hospitals that are going through what you're seeing in New York that are maxed out. Our hospitals in Atlanta, except for 1 hospital in Albany, Georgia, not a one of them got to 70 to 80% capacity for their ICU or anything like that. We have the capacity to solve that problem. There's really no reason to have 250 beds sitting empty while we're trying to solve that problem, which is a ICU and other kind of problem.
And one more point I'd love to get your thought on, Rick Jackson, before we let you go, and that is we've already been facing a crisis of skyrocketing healthcare costs in this country. Now, as a result of hospitals losing revenue, looking at the prospect of closing down, same thing with doctors' offices and what have you, we're looking down at the prospect of an even greater crisis of healthcare costs, I believe, and then also a greater crisis of healthcare access, where across the countries, especially in rural and mountainous communities, you have already been seeing difficulties for patients to be able to access care.
Well, in small communities and outpatient services, physical therapy, all these, They're not getting the bailout that some of the hospitals and other people are. All these outpatient services, and the smaller hospitals in rural America are on the brink of going out of business in the first place. So I'm really concerned that this is going to put them over the top. And you need, economically, for every town, the healthcare hospital in a small town is the #1 economic driver of that town, bar none. I mean, it is a huge impact on that. And if they lose that, not only do they lose the economic engine of that area, but they also lose the capability of having good health care, and they're going to have to drive an hour somewhere, which, time is really precious when it's an emergency, when you have to drive a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. Rick Jackson, I could continue asking you a whole slew of other questions because there's so many different aspects to this. I appreciate you joining us today. Of course, Chairman and CEO of Jackson Healthcare. Thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Jimmy. Glad to be with you.
Thank you. Again, Rick Jackson joining us. His company, Jackson Healthcare, staffs over 3,000 U.S. hospitals with clinicians and treats 10 million patients annually. They're in the thick of it. And we need to heed the warnings that Jackson Healthcare and others are talking about, are giving us. We need to get things reopened. We don't have time to just think, oh, this is one issue area. What we're hearing in this discussion, what we just heard from Rick Jackson, is that there is so much focus, understandably, but there is so much focus on COVID-19 that countless other health issues are not being handled. He told the story of a woman who's now been waiting almost 3 full months since her biopsy was canceled. This is life or death for millions of other people across the country in other areas. Hospital beds open in empty hospitals across the country. The economic impact is just one part of this whole discussion about reopening America. We're also talking about all the social impacts and the healthcare impacts. And politicians, scientists, and the people in the bureaucracy and the media who were single-mindedly focused solely on addressing COVID-19 in ways that are often draconian in terms of the policies and individual liberties, that discount the economic impact, that discount the social and healthcare impact. They need to wake up and start considering that there is more going on here. Not only that, if you could pull up, Nathan, cut 4 that we played earlier from Bill de Blasio. You have mayors and governors across the country in, yes, blue states. Sure, the President of the United States shouldn't highlight the political leanings of a state, but the reality is they are blue states, and they are states that have been fiscally mismanaged for years. And now that fiscal irresponsibility is sort of coming due. And you have somebody like Bill de Blasio, mayor of New York City, the largest city in this country, begging the federal government for a bailout. Here's a clip we played earlier.
You're talking about what would be a 4th stimulus plan, direct federal funding to states and cities. And to that, as you said, the president has said mixed messages, but one of the things he said is, I don't think Republicans want to be in a position where they bail out states that are or have been mismanaged over a long period of time.
Yeah, John, it's astounding that he even introduces the question of red states and blue states. He's saying it out loud. He is politicizing a pandemic, not being patriotic, not talking about all Americans and how to bring us all back together. We're all connected. This is the largest city in the country. We help lead the national economy for everyone. We send a huge amount of money to Washington, much more than we get back. And this is a city that has been succeeding. We've had record low unemployment before this crisis. We're the safest big city in America. Crime levels down to where they were in the 1950s, a thriving economy. We've been succeeding here. A lot of cities have been succeeding in helping the American economy. And now the president's turning his back because of partisan affiliation. Who does that, John? What kind of president in the middle of a crisis says, well, I'm going to help you, but I'm not going to help you because of what's on your voter registration card? No, what we need here is a stimulus that puts us all back on our feet so we can succeed together. If it doesn't happen, I guarantee you there's no recovery. And I hate saying that, but John, it's the truth. If there is not a strong fourth stimulus for cities and states, there will not be a national economic recovery, period.
What Bill de Blasio is looking for is not just support to make up for policies that they already put in effect, and previously with the guidance of the federal government. What Bill de Blasio is looking for now is a bailout on future policies moving forward and for an excuse from the federal government for him to perpetuate these policies that he can most definitely start winding down. Across the country, we can see the wind down taking place realistically and begin a full-throated reopening of this country. But what he and other governors and mayors around the country and big cities and big states that have been fiscally mismanaged in countless ways, what he is looking for now is not just a bailout for past policies that they failed to address, such as pension crises and other issues, or a bailout for what's happened over the last couple of months, and yes, a loss of revenue because of the shutdown of economic activity and so forth. But he's particularly looking for an excuse to keep this thing going. Because if the federal government will continue to backfill these states and these major cities, then they have every reason to just continue these policies that are unnecessary, increasingly so. Now, this is in New York City that Rick Jackson of Jackson Healthcare was talking about before. And by the way, if you didn't see the interview, that is a must-watch interview with Rick Jackson. But he was saying 3 hospitals in New York State with 3 COVID-19 patients, 100 beds open. We're not treating people who may have cancer, don't know it yet, need the biopsy, not able to get the biopsy. We're not treating people with a whole slew of health concerns. We're keeping people locked up in their homes where they may be in more abusive situations, where they may be not wanting to go to a physician for a serious issue, maybe heart issues, because of fear of getting COVID-19, when in reality most hospitals don't have many COVID-19 patients, but they are in fear of going to get that care. And because we talked about this with Charlie Katibi of Americans for Prosperity yesterday, because of all the red tape, it's hard for people in state after state to access healthcare services through telemedicine. Those reforms need to be fixed. Again, if there's any lesson we learn from this crisis, it is that government is getting in the way far too much of healthcare providers from being able to do what they do best. Literally getting in the way right now by saying, no, you can't do that. You can't do a biopsy for someone who might have cancer. And the list goes on for other issues that they may have. You can't do that, but there's also red tape making it difficult for things like telehealth services across the country, and for physicians to be able to practice across state lines and what have you. These are things we need to address. And the FDA, we talked about a little bit with Bazzel Baz before. The Food and Drug Administration is getting in the way all too often of patients being able to access medical treatments that could be life-saving. The FDA has a role to play with safety. Is this drug safe? Yes, okay, do what you want. Off-label use is fine. Hydroxychloroquine, tremendous benefits being seen. The media, politicians, trying to discredit it for their own motivations. Then there is remdesivir. Remdesivir, promising treatment as well. We talked about that last week with Dr. Dennis Durrell, hospitalist. That's holding tremendous promise. And they're talking about that one. Good. But the problems that we're facing right now are much more about government getting in the way of innovation and patient freedom and economic growth and prosperity, and the potential for individuals to make their own lives better. Yes, it's absolutely time to reopen America. We need to take precautions, sure, for a virus that has killed tens of thousands of Americans. But the idea that these policies are justified by the data at this point is just not there. The support is just not there anymore. I said here in Colorado, for example, April 30th, fine. Do the month of April, do the shutdowns. I wish we hadn't. I didn't think we should have. I thought other policies in Colorado were in place prior to the shutdown that made sense. Now the reopening has been starting, slowly but surely. Fine, you had your month of April. We flattened the curve. Now the data is not justifying this. In fact, the data is justifying a reopening, certainly starting with the healthcare space, but a hell of a lot of other things too. And just finally, because a lot of people point out, oh, well, if you reopen, it doesn't mean people are going to start going to sports games, that people are going to start going to restaurants and to movie theaters, because there's still going to be that fear and that concern. Well, of course there will be. But at least businesses can make that determination themselves, and individuals can make that determination themselves. There are children in this country who need their parents to take care of them. Most definitely. The rest of us are adults who can reason, who can think, who can make decisions of our own accord, and don't need some nanny state government telling us what we need to do or what we can and can't do. Especially doctors, physicians, people who are providing health care, and as Rick Jackson pointed out, are dealing with infectious diseases day in and day out. Do we seriously think that medical providers who have sworn to do no harm are going to be reckless and irresponsible and say, oh, come in, when they're concerned that maybe a patient might get this virus? Yes, they have financial concerns, but they also have a duty and a responsibility to provide care to their patients. Good quality care, and they know that. That's what they're in the business of doing. And right now, we have politicians who are all-knowing and all-powerful and narrow-minded public health bureaucrats in health departments across the country or in the Trump administration who are saying, nope, we just got to focus on this, to hell with the fact that we have hospital bed after hospital bed available. I'm hardly even talking about the jobs and economic impact, but much more focusing here on the social impact and the health impact. The more the time has progressed, the more I've seen the data, the more I've seen these debates, the more I've seen Bill de Blasio and Chris Cuomo and the mayor of Chicago and Neil Ferguson, the guy who is probably more than anybody else responsible for these shutdowns, buck the shutdowns and say, I'm not going to follow my own guidance. Instead, I'm going to do what I want to do because, hey, I'm in charge. I make the rules, and I can do what I want to do here. I don't care if the people have to follow these rules and stay home. I'm going to do what I want to do. The more I see all of those things, the more I see people who are finding their businesses, their livelihood shut down, and potentially indefinitely, the more sick and tired of this shutdown, the more passionately I become about reopening. The data's there to reopen. The economy needs it. People need it. Lives and livelihoods need it. Both lives, saving lives and saving livelihoods, need it. It's time to get things going again. In fact, it's past time. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger. That is it for us today. Thanks so much for joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. My thanks again to Rick Jackson of Jackson Healthcare, Bazzel Baz, good friend of the show, and Spencer Brown of Young America's Foundation for joining us today. Great conversations with every one of them. My thanks as well to Nathan Matoush, producer extraordinaire, working the Matoush magic, plus the Washington Examiner, our partners here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. I am Jimmy Sengenberger. Stay well, stay healthy, and as always, may God bless America.